Welcome everybody to A Conservative Voice episode 1. We will be discussing the recent Let Women Speak protest held last week on the steps of the Victorian Parliament. The attendance of to the rally by the MP Moira Deeming resulted in a 9-month suspension from the Victorian Liberal Party, which we believe to be a comical error on behalf of the Liberal leader, John Pesutto. We think that this response has been cowardly, woke, and reeks of poor leadership. Definitely not appropriate for a party leader. He should step down. If you want to defend women and people exercising their right to protest, then it's not fit to lead the state nor the opposition party.
So another unprecedented event in Victoria's political sphere, and we'll start by explaining last week's event and what happened in Melbourne and how this relates. In the wake of the fast-growing worldwide trans movement, last Saturday, a group of women gathered on the steps of Parliament House to express their concerns in regard for the growing topic of trans rights, how it is addressed and pictured within the context of children's education, the presence of trans men in women's prisons, their access to women's bathrooms, and their participation in women's sport. The so-called anti-trans activist, Callie J. Keane-Minshaw, is a prominent advocate for women's rights and goes by Posy Parker. She was the one who hosted the event and has continued her Let Women Speak tour in other states of Australia, including New Zealand as well. Now, at the same time of this rally, counter-protests advocating for trans rights were present, and the event was eventually gatecrashed by Nazi protesters. Liberal MP Moira Deeming also attended in support of the Let Women Speak rally. She was slammed for doing so due to the presence of Nazis. And instead of supporting the MP, who was wrongly accused of being one, she was shamed publicly by Premier Daniel Andrews and also the leader of her own party. This disappoints us a lot because we don't expect anything less from Daniel Andrews. But the leader of the Liberals, who is supposed to be the voice of reason and this alternative to this crazy wokeness, is bending over to the left. Now, in an effort to save his face, John Pesutto initially moved to expel her permanently. This sets a dangerous precedent. Firstly, people wrongly accused of being a Nazi shouldn't just be banished from society. We live in Australia, we're a civilised society with a democracy. People have a right to a free and fair trial. People aren't guilty by association and they're innocent until proven guilty.
To start with, I think it's important to mention that we are labeling as anti-trans women that are simply asking to not have biological men in women's bathroom or in women's prison, for biological men to play in women's sport. I mean, I believe this is pretty black and white. Biological men have different structural, physical, and biological differences that are undeniable, and it is undeniable that that does have an impact on athletic performance. If that was not the case, we would not have men's and women's leagues in the first place. I do not believe that this is practicing hate speech. I personally have nothing against trans people or people with different sexual orientation. I think this is within their personal right to feel and be who they want to be. But I think that should not cross other women's rights, and I think that instead trans people should advocate for being provided with bathrooms and other facilities for people of all genders, so that everybody can live without crossing others' boundaries, and also for transgender leagues to be introduced in sport. That, to my eyes, would be a more appropriate approach. What do you think, Eddie, especially considering that you are yourself an athlete?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there, Bianca, and I think I don't just speak for the majority of Victorians, but majority of people, that it's reasonable in any way for us to question the safety of women and girls when it's supposedly okay now for biological males to compete alongside us. Now, activists are really quick to say that because they're on testosterone suppressants that it's fine. But for one, the levels of a man on testosterone repressants is still so much higher than a woman's level. Now, and then secondly, hormone levels aren't the only factor. They're one of many. If a man goes through puberty as a male, he doesn't belong in women's sports. His lung capacity, because his lungs are bigger. The size of his heart gives him a higher VO2 max. His overall muscle mass and bone density are just a few factors that give men such an advantage that makes them dangerous when competing in female sport. Even if people disagree with what I've just said, if we allow this trend to continue, it will result in the death of women's sports. Every day I train in my boxing gym alongside men. And every single female in there will tell you that men punch significantly harder. They're stronger than us, they're faster than us, and they begin at an overall fitter base than us. Any sensible boy in there will pull his punches when boxing against a female, and my coach regularly reminds the guys that they need to do this.
Yeah, and we also have reports about sexual abuse carried out by transgender people in women's bathroom, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And unfortunately, we also have instances of them potentially sexually assaulting women in prisons. Now, last year, the Daily Wire investigated and exposed a case where a high school in Loudoun County, Virginia, had a male student charged with anal sodomy and forcible fellatio. This occurred against a female student in the girls' bathroom, and the student that's been charged was dressed in a skirt and identified as gender fluid. Again, reported by the Daily Wire, because the mainstream media keeps completely silent on this, a trans inmate at a female-only prison in New Jersey was relocated after getting not one, but two other inmates there pregnant. Now, there's claims that the sex was consensual, but if we use an ounce of our own critical thinking and consider the circumstances of trying to survive in prison as a female against biological men who have a significant strength advantage, and the fact that these two women have ended up pregnant in quite possibly the worst environment I can think of to be nursing a child, we can see the clear danger of men invading what is supposed to be a women's only space for good reason. And Bianca, I want you to guess, this same prison, which is called the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility, has how many trans inmates?
How many?
27.
That is shocking.
And all out of all the other men's correctional facilities, how many do you think they have?
How many?
None. No surprises there. And I think that really proves that this is a war on women when men are invading women's only spaces and getting them pregnant, despite the fact that the sex is consensual in prison. You know, another incident is Isla Bronson, who's a trans woman from Scotland, was found guilty of raping two women before he began his transition into one. He was deemed to be of high risk of reoffending and was placed on the sex offenders registry, but originally he was placed in a female-only prison and would have stayed there if not for the backlash from one, the public, and two, some outspoken politicians who had the guts to stand up for girls.
Wow. Well, we don't really hear these stories in the mainstream media, do we? And this is why I really wanted to speak about this issue here. Women have all the reason to be worried about giving trans men access to women's bathroom and sports and prisons, and they should have every right to talk about it and be heard by our politicians without being labeled as extremists or instigating hate and violence against transgender people. Obviously, transgender people are not all criminal, like not all men and women are all criminal. But there is a serious, room for real concerns here based on evidence. And I think that the mainstream media approach to the Let Women Speak protest was absolutely inappropriate. All the attention was steered towards the neo-Nazis that infiltrated the protest, and not only that, they have been trying to picture the women that were here there trying to be heard as the bad guys. And this, I guess, brings us back to Moira Deeming getting suspended from the Liberal Party.
Yeah. So despite Prosciutto's efforts, she wasn't expelled. She's now suspended from the Vic Liberal branch for 9 months after attending the protest. And a few days ago, prominent members of the state Liberal Party actually spoke on her behalf, urging Liberal leader John Prosciutto to rethink his decision. Instead of supporting her, he chose to condemn her, suspended her for 9 months, and ignored the issues posed to biological women. Talk about missing the big picture.
Exactly. I mean, the whole reason of the protest was for the women to raise their concerns to our leader. But the whole thing turned into a tragic comic drama that is centered on anything but the actual issue. And on top of this, at a time where the whole government narrative is all about indigenous voice, transgender rights, and that is all good because that suits the current government's narrative. But as a result, they are suppressing the voice of women and they are putting fear into people for speaking their mind. Once again, and, you are an extremist, you indulge into hate speech, especially if we then have party leaders suspending the politician from the party. I think this is just outrageous and really sends the wrong message out to the wider population. Then we look at the same event held in Canberra when Senator Lydia Thorpe interrupted the speaker, again, Kelly J's speech, in a quite inappropriate way. I mean, that is a senator that we're talking about. No wonder why people act the way they do within such a society. And, what example are our politician giving out to people? I think is one of division of hate and oppression for anyone with a different view.
Yeah, I completely agree. Bushido had the perfect opportunity to appeal to the majority of Victorians. Despite this left versus right divide, majority of people do not support men in women's prisons or in sports. Um, and he could have shown support for women who feel crushed by trans activists. And it just would have been the ideal olive branch that the Liberal Party could have been seen to be extending. Instead, Bushido decided he would try out left the left. God knows why. That sort of leads us to Pauline Hanson, who, being a genuine leader who's not afraid to say what she thinks and stand up for what she believes is right. She's got real care for, women and their safety. She extended an invitation to Deeming and offered her support. Now, you and I, we would obviously love to see her join One Nation, because instances such as this just lead me to believe the future of the Liberal Party is over. And moving forward, I think it's really critical that the Liberal Party starts to support victims such as Deeming. One, they need to be seen to stand up for women's rights, because Labor and the Greens, they're on board with this trans activism. And if the Liberal Party aren't going to step up and protect these basic rights, another party will. And that's who people on the right or moderately are going to vote for, not them. Now, majority of Victorians sit on the side of protecting women and do not want girls competing against men in AFL matches or being impregnated in prisons. We believe Bushido should step down as a Liberal Party leader if it wasn't obvious enough already. And I personally would like to see Ryan Smith step up and take his place, with Deeming issued an apology, support from the party, and her role as party whip reinstated. It's time to take a stand, Liberal Party, and say what everyone is thinking. The future of your daughters, our daughters, and their future grandchildren depends on it.
Yeah, and honestly, if I was in Moira Deeming, I would not want to go back after being reserved such a treatment. Pauline Hanson is welcoming her in One Nation with open arms, and I think that Moira should really be giving it a thought. So, guys, that is all for today. I hope we gave you all a good idea of what has been happening here in Melbourne over the past week in regard to the transgender movement and what happened to Moira Deeming. And we will see you in the next episode.